The great chamber of the conclave stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian, and within its walls sat the representatives of 4,000 species who had learned to travel between the stars, long before humanity had discovered Fire Ambassador. Thesin of the Relari pressed her four-fingered hand against the voting console and watched the results flash across the massive display screen that dominated the northern wall of the chamber. And she felt nothing at all as she recorded her vote in favor of the harvest. The Vethkai Dominion had submitted their petition 6 cycles ago, and the matter was simple enough that most species had not even bothered to send their senior diplomats to the session. Sol 3, the Vethkai called it. Though the primitive inhabitants apparently referred to their world as Earth, Thyssen had reviewed the file on her journey to the conclave, and she had found nothing remarkable about the species that lived there. Were soft-skinned bipeds with an average lifespan of less than a century, and they had only recently discovered how to split atoms and broadcast signals into the void. Between worlds, they possessed no faster-than-light technology, no energy shields, no weapons that could scratch the hull of even the smallest Vethkai scout ship. And most importantly, they had no allies among the stars because they did not even know that life existed beyond their own small blue world. The vote concluded with a result of 3,847 in favor and only 12 opposed. And Thesin noted with mild curiosity that the 12 dissenting votes had come from species known for their excessive sentimentality about primitive life forms. Grand Admiral Kethvoran of the Vethkai Dominion rose from his seat in the petitioner's circle, and his massive frame cast a shadow across the delegation seated in the front rows as he spread his forearms wide in a gesture of formal gratitude. The Dominion thanks the conclave for its wisdom, he declared in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. And we assure this assembly that the harvest of Sol 3 will be conducted in accordance with all established protocols. Thesin had heard these words many times before, and she knew exactly what they meant. The Vethkai would descend upon the planet called Earth with their warships and their ground forces, and they would strip the world of every resource that held value, including the inhabitants themselves. Some of the humans would be taken as laborers, and others would serve purposes that Thesin preferred not to think about too deeply. And within a generation, the species would exist only in the conclave's archives as another entry in the long list of civilizations that had been harvested before they could reach the stars. It was not cruelty, Thesin reminded herself as she gathered her documents and prepared to leave the chamber. It was simply the way of things. The Vethkai had conducted over 200 harvests in the past 10,000 years, and not once had a target species managed to offer any meaningful resistance. The strong consumed the weak, and the galaxy continued to turn. And there was no point in feeling sympathy for creatures who had been doomed by the simple accident of being discovered too soon. As she walked through the corridors of the conclave station, Thesin passed a junior diplomat from the Key 3 delegation who was studying a holographic display of the Sol system with an expression of mild interest. "Have you seen their broadcasts?" the young Kithri asked, gesturing toward the display where primitive two-dimensional images flickered and changed. Thesin paused and watched for a moment as the humans on the screen engaged in what appeared to be some form of organized violence, throwing their bodies against each other while crowds of their kind watched and cheered. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "They call it football." The Kithri replied with a sound that might have been a laugh. "And apparently they have dozens of variations of this activity, all of which involve causing physical harm to each other for entertainment." Thesin shook her head and continued walking, dismissing the images from her mind as the peculiar habits of a species that would soon cease to exist. 600 Vethkai warships were already being assembled for the journey to Sol 3. Though everyone knew that such a force was excessive beyond all reason, the Dominion had never needed more than 50 ships to harvest a pre-spacefaring world. But the Vethkai were nothing if not theatrical in their conquests. Armada would arrive at Earth in approximately 18 standard months, and the harvest would be complete within days of their arrival. And the humans would join the long list of species who had looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone without ever learning the terrible answer to that question before the fleet departed. However, protocol required one final formality. The Conclave's charter demanded that any species marked for harvest must receive official notification of their fate, a requirement that had been added centuries ago by delegates who believed that even doomed civilizations deserved the dignity of knowing what was coming. Thyssen had always found this requirement to be pointlessly cruel, like telling a condemned prisoner the exact method of their execution. But the rules were the rules. The message was composed according to the standard template and broadcast toward Earth on frequencies that the humans would be able to detect. And it contained all the relevant information about the harvest that was to come, including the size of the approaching fleet and the estimated date of arrival. The Conclave expected no response, because there had never been a response. Because what could a primitive species possibly say to the announcement of their own extinction? Thyssen returned to her quarters and began preparing for the next session of the Conclave, which would address a trade dispute between two agricultural worlds that had been arguing about water rights for the past century. And she did not give the humans of Earth another thought. She did not know that 72 hours after the transmission reached the small blue world in the Sol system, everything would change. She did not know that the message she had helped authorize would be detected by human radio telescopes and decoded by human scientists and delivered to human leaders who would read it with a mixture of terror and cold fury. She did not know that the species she had dismissed as primitive and doomed would respond to the news of their extinction not with despair or acceptance, but with something far more dangerous. She did not know that humanity was about to send a message of their own, and that this message would shake the foundations of galactic civilization in ways that no one could have predicted. But she would learn, they would all learn, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday evening, the entire world knew that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that the universe wanted them. Dead President Clara Martinez stood in the Situation room beneath the White House and stared at the translation that her team of scientists had prepared. And she read the words 3 times before she allowed herself to believe that they were real. 600 warships were coming, and they would arrive in 80 months. And when they arrived, they would take everything and everyone. And there was nothing that humanity could do to stop them. The first reaction was panic, and it spread across the planet like wildfire through dry grass. Stock markets crashed within hours of the announcement, and religious leaders declared that the end times had arrived, and millions of people took to the streets in every major city on Earth, some praying and some rioting and some simply standing in silence as they tried to understand how their world had changed forever. But President Martinez did not have time for panic, and neither did the other leaders who gathered for an emergency summit in Geneva 3 days after the message arrived. General Yoon Park of South Korea stood before the assembled representatives of every nation on Earth and spoke with a calm that she did not feel. "We have 80 months, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "And we cannot build weapons that will stop them. And we cannot hide from sensors that can detect our cities from light years away. And we cannot run because we have nowhere to go." The room was silent as the leaders of humanity absorbed the truth of her words. "So what do we do?" asked the Prime Minister of India. His voice barely above a whisper. General Park looked around the room at the faces of the most powerful people on Earth, and she saw the same fear in every pair of eyes. And she knew that fear would destroy them faster than any alien armada if they allowed it to take root. We do what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds, she said. We adapt, we think, and we fight with whatever weapons we have. The weapons they had were not missiles or bombs or anything that could scratch the hull of a Vethkai warship. And General Park knew this better than anyone. But humanity had other weapons. Weapons that had carried them through ice ages and plagues and wars that had killed millions. Weapons that no other species in the galaxy seemed to possess. They had spite and stubbornness, and a refusal to accept defeat that bordered on insanity. Dr. Emil Vasquez was a games theorist from Argentina who had spent his career studying the mathematics of conflict. And when the call came asking him to join the newly formed United Earth Defense Council, he left his university within the hour. He stood before the council 2 weeks later with a presentation that would change the course of history. Vethkai have harvested over 200 species, he explained, his hands trembling slightly as he advanced to the next slide. And not one of those species ever offered meaningful resistance, which means the Vethkai have never had to deal with a species that refuses to surrender. General Park leaned forward in her chair and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What exactly are you suggesting, Doctor? Dr. Vasquez took a deep breath and clicked to a slide that showed a simple diagram of two stick figures facing each other, one much larger than the other. The Vethkai are predators, he said. And predators understand strength, but they also understand something else. Something that every predator learns to fear. He paused and looked around the room. They fear prey that fights back, because even a small wound can become infected, and even a weak enemy can get lucky. And no predator wants to risk injury when there are easier meals available. The room was silent as the implications of his words sank in. We cannot defeat them, Dr. Vasquez continued, but we can make them afraid of what defeating us might cost. And we can make the rest of the galaxy afraid of what will happen if the Vethkai fail to kill every last one of us. The plan that emerged over the following weeks was unlike anything humanity had ever attempted. Teams of psychologists and sociologists studied every scrap of information about alien species that could be extracted from the original message, and they built profiles of how these species thought and what they feared and what would make them hesitate. Teams of historians compiled a record of every war humanity had ever fought, every atrocity committed, every moment when humans had chosen death over surrender and revenge over peace. Teams of linguists worked to translate this record into every known alien language, and they crafted words designed to strike at the deepest fears of species who had never known a predator more dangerous than themselves. And through it all, the clock continued to tick. Months passed, and the Vethkai armada drew closer. And humanity prepared not for a battle they could not win, but for a gamble that would determine the fate of their species. General Park stood in the command center on the day the message was ready, and she looked at the faces of the men and women who had worked without sleep to give humanity a chance. This is it, she said. Everything we are, everything we have ever been, compressed into a single transmission. She paused and thought about her children and her grandchildren and all the generations of humanity that might never exist if this gamble failed. We are about to tell the galaxy who we really are, she continued, and we are betting everything that the truth will be enough to save us. The technician at the communications console looked up and waited for the order. General Park nodded. Send it. The message launched into space at the speed of light, carrying with it the hopes and fears of 8 billion human beings. And nobody knew if it would save them or doom them or simply disappear into the void without changing anything at all, but they had done everything they could. And now all that remained was to wait and see how the galaxy would respond to the species called humanity. They did not have to wait long. Fleet Commander Vorath stood on the bridge of the consuming tide and watched. The stars blur past the observation windows as his armada raced toward the small blue world that would soon belong to the Swiss Dominion. He had commanded over 30 harvests in his long career, and each one had been easier than the last, and he expected this mission to be the simplest of all. Humans were primitives who had only recently learned to leave their own atmosphere, and they possessed no weapons that could threaten his ships, and they had no allies who might come to their rescue. This would be a slaughter, quick and efficient. And Vorath would add another world to his collection of conquered territories. His communications officer interrupted his thoughts with a sound of confusion. "Commander, we are receiving a transmission from the target world." Vorath turned and raised one of his 4 arms in a gesture of mild interest. "A surrender already?" he asked, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "They must have detected our approach. How delightful that they wish to beg for mercy before we even arrive." The communications officer hesitated, and Vorath noticed that the young warrior's scales had turned a pale shade of gray. "It does not appear to be a surrender, Commander. It is something else entirely." Vorath strode across the bridge and loomed over the communications console, his massive form casting a shadow over the trembling officer. "Play it," he commanded. The message began with words that were calm and measured and carried no trace of the fear that Vorath had expected. "To the conclave of aligned worlds and the Vethkai Dominion," the human voice said. "We are the species known as humanity, and you have declared intent to harvest our world." Vorath settled into his command chair and prepared to enjoy what he assumed would be a pathetic attempt at negotiation. Perhaps an offer of tribute or a plea for the lives of their children. But the message did not beg. "We understand your capabilities exceed ours," the voice continued, "and we cannot stop you. However, before you proceed, we believe you should know what you are harvesting." The transmission shifted to include data files, thousands of them, each one containing records and images and videos that the humans had compiled about themselves. Vorath watched with growing unease as the history of humanity unfolded before him. Saw wars that had consumed entire continents, battles where millions had died fighting over patches of land smaller than the smallest Vethkai colony ship. He saw weapons that could destroy cities in a single flash of light, weapons that the humans had built and pointed at each other, even knowing that using them would mean the end of their civilization. He saw humans killing other humans for reasons of religion and race and politics and simple greed. An endless parade of violence that stretched back to the very beginning of their recorded history. He saw humans who had survived being shot and stabbed and burned and had returned to fight again. Humans who had crawled through mud and blood to reach their enemies. Humans who had died with their hands wrapped around the throats of those who had killed them. The voice returned, still calm, still measured. "We have killed 200 million of our own kind in the last century alone. And we developed weapons capable of ending all life on our world and chose to build more. And we have never known lasting peace, and we do not surrender. And we do not forgive." Vorath felt something cold settle in his chest. Something he had not felt in many years. Something that might have been the first stirring of doubt. "We have taught our children that dying on your feet is better than living on your knees," the voice said. "And we are not sending this message to frighten you. We are sending it to warn you." The bridge of the consuming tide had fallen silent, and every officer stared at their console or at the floor, or at anything other than the images that continued to play on the main display. "If you take our world, some of us will survive. We always do, and we will remember. We will find you, not in a year, not in a century, but eventually. Your children will grow up afraid of the dark, knowing that something is out there hunting them, because you made the mistake of teaching us you exist." Varth gripped the arms of his command chair so tightly that the metal groaned beneath his claws. "We do not ask for mercy," the human voice concluded. "We offer you a choice. Leave us alone and we will stay on our world. We will even pretend this never happened, but if you come, we will follow you home." The transmission ended, and silence hung over the bridge like a funeral shroud. Varth turned to look at his officers and saw expressions he had never seen on Vethkai faces during a harvest. "Mission," he saw fear. "Commander," his tactical officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have analyzed the data they sent. Their claims appear to be accurate. They really have done these things to themselves." Varth rose from his chair and walked to the observation window, staring out at the stars that suddenly seemed less welcoming than they had moments ago. "It changes nothing," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "We have 600 warships. They have nothing that can touch us." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that something had changed. And he knew that every member of his crew was thinking the same thought. What if they failed to kill all of them? What if even a few humans survived and escaped into the galaxy with nothing left to lose? What if the humans meant exactly what they said? Across the galaxy, the message spread like a plague through the Conclave's communication networks. And species who had lived in fear of the Vethkai for millennia began to ask questions they had never dared to ask before. What kind of species fights itself for sport? What kind of species builds weapons to destroy their own world? What kind of species sends a message like that instead of begging for their lives? And the most terrifying question of all, the question that kept ambassadors awake at night and made admirals cancel their dinner appointments: what happens if the Vethkai fail? The Conclave chamber had not seen such chaos since the trade wars of the third millennium. And Ambassador Thiessen stood at her podium and watched as delegations shouted at each other across the vast space that had been designed to encourage calm and rational debate. She had voted for the harvest of Earth 18 months ago without a second thought. And now she wondered if that vote had been the greatest mistake of her career. The message from humanity had spread through every network in the galaxy, and the response had been unlike anything the Conclave had ever witnessed. 4,000 emergency petitions had arrived within hours of the broadcast, and not one of them was about saving the humans. They were about what would happen after. The Rolari delegation moves for immediate suspension of harvestment rights, shouted a representative from her own homeworld. "The risks are too great." "Cowardice," bellowed Grand Admiral Kethvorin from the Vethkai platform, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of contempt. "You would let a species of primitives frighten you with words alone." But Thiessen could see that even the mighty Vethkai were shaken, and she noticed that Kethvorin's scales had lost some of their usual luster. The Conclave's senior psychologist had released a classified assessment of humanity 3 days ago, and the document had leaked within hours. Thiessen had read it 7 times, and each reading had left her more disturbed than the loss. The humans displayed behavioral patterns that had no equivalent in any of the 4,000 species cataloged by the CIS Conclave. They called it pack bonding, aggression, the tendency to form intense emotional attachments to individuals and groups, and to respond with extreme violence when those attachments were threatened. They called it spite-based persistence, the willingness to accept personal destruction in order to harm an enemy, even when no tactical advantage could be gained. They called it trauma weaponization, the ability to transform suffering and loss into motivation for future conflict, sometimes across multiple generations. The report had concluded with a warning that Thiessen could not stop thinking about. "Humans do not fight to win," the psychologist had written. "They fight to make their enemies lose. And they will continue fighting long after any rational species would have surrendered. And they will teach their children to continue the fight after they are gone." A representative from the K3 delegation rose and activated her translation matrix. "I have studied the human records they transmitted," she said, "and I found something that I believe this assembly needs to see." The main display flickered to life and showed images of a human conflict from their recent history. A war they called World War II. Thyssen watched as the K3 highlighted a particular group of humans who had been conquered by a larger force and had been expected to submit instead. They had formed resistance movements that continued fighting for years, sabotaging and assassinating and refusing to accept defeat, even when their situation was completely hopeless. They call this guerrilla warfare, the K3 explained, and they have been practicing it for thousands of years. And the interesting thing is that it often works, not because they defeat their enemies in open battle, but because they make occupation so costly that their enemies eventually give up and leave. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. "But we have 600 warships," Cathvorin protested, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "We will not occupy their world. We will harvest it completely. There will be no one left to resist. Are you certain of that?" asked a small voice from the back of the chamber. Every head turned to see a junior analyst from the Conclave's Strategic Assessment Division, a young Morthian who looked terrified to be speaking before such an assembly. "I have been studying human biology," the analyst continued, his voice trembling, "and they are remarkably difficult to kill. They can survive wounds that would be fatal to most species. They can function without food for weeks and without water for days. They can adapt to almost any environment. And they breed quickly." He paused and looked down at his notes. "Even if the harvest achieves 99% efficiency, that would leave approximately 80 million humans alive. And based on their historical population recovery rates, they could return to pre-harvest numbers within a few centuries." Cathvorin slammed his fist against his podium with enough force to crack the ancient wood. "Then we will achieve 100% efficiency," he roared, but Thyssen saw the doubt in his eyes, and she knew that everyone else saw it too. 100% efficiency had never been achieved in any harvest, and the Vethkai had never faced a species that would fight back with such determination. The session dissolved into chaos once again, with species demanding action and counteraction and committees to study the problem and emergency protocols that had never been used in living memory. But outside the chamber, something else was happening. Species who had lived in terror of the Vethkai for millennia were beginning to make quiet calculations. If humanity survived, they would need allies, and they would remember who had helped them and who had not. If humanity survived, they would eventually develop space travel, and they would become a force in galactic politics. And their friendship or their enmity would matter. Messages began to travel through back channels and encrypted networks. Messages offering technology and resources and intelligence to the small blue world that was about to face the greatest military force in the galaxy. Not because these species cared about humans, but because they feared what humans might become. And then, as the Vethkai Armada entered the Sol system and prepared for the final approach to Earth, humanity played its second card. New transmission burst across the galactic networks, shorter than the first, but somehow more terrifying. To the Vethkai Dominion, it said, "We have analyzed the metadata from your original message, and we now know the location of your homeworld. We know where your children sleep. We know where your elders gather. We know the coordinates of every major population center on every planet you control." The message paused, and when it continued, the voice was cold and hard as steel. "You can still turn back, or you can come and take our world, but know this: we will hide some of our people, and they will build ships, and they will find you. And they will make you understand what it means to threaten humanity on the bridge of the consuming tide." Fleet Commander Vorath stared at his tactical display and saw the small blue planet that should have been an easy conquest For the first time in his long career, he ordered his fleet to halt, not because he feared defeat, but because he finally understood that with humans, there was no such thing as total victory. The galaxy held its breath as 600 Vethkai warships hung motionless in the darkness beyond Mars. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the greatest military force in known space hesitated before a world that could not fight back Fleet Commander. Vareth stood alone in his quarters and stared at the tactical display that showed the small blue planet called Earth. And he tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. He had commanded 30 harvests without a single complication, and he had expected this mission to be the easiest of all. And instead he found himself facing a choice that no Vethkai commander had ever been forced to make. The Conclave had transmitted an emergency order that morning, demanding a temporary suspension of all hostile action pending diplomatic negotiations. It was the first time the Conclave had ever interfered with a lawfully approved harvest. And Vareth knew that the political implications would echo through galactic society for centuries, but he also knew why. They had done it. The humans had not threatened the Vethkai. Alone they had threatened to become a problem for every one ambassador. Thiessen arrived at Earth aboard a neutral diplomatic vessel 3 days later, and she descended through the atmosphere with a mixture of curiosity and dread. She had studied every record and every transmission and every analysis that the Conclave had compiled about humanity, and she thought she understood what she was dealing with. She was wrong. General Unipark met her at the landing site, a flat stretch of concrete surrounded by mountains that the humans called Colorado. And Thiessen was immediately struck by how small and fragile the human leader appeared. Park stood barely higher than Thiessen's lower shoulders, and her body showed none of the natural armor or weapons that characterized most spacefaring species. And yet, she carried herself with a confidence that Thiessen had only seen in Apex Predator's ambassador, Park said, extending one of her small hands in a gesture that Thiessen had learned was called a handshake. "Welcome to Earth. I hope your journey was comfortable." Thiessen accepted the gesture and felt a surprising strength in the human's grip. "I expected to find a world in chaos," she admitted. "Your people have just learned that they are not alone in the universe, and that the universe tried to kill them." Park smiled, and something in that expression made Thiessen's scales prickle with unease. "We have been trying to kill ourselves for thousands of years," the general replied. "This is just another Tuesday." The negotiations that followed were unlike any diplomatic exchange in Conclave history. Thiessen had been authorized to offer Earth a protected status, a designation that would prevent future harvests in exchange for certain restrictions on human expansion and development. Park rejected the offer within minutes. "You want us to stay on our world and be grateful that you decided not to exterminate us," she said, her voice calm but her eyes hard as stone. "That is not acceptable." Thiessen spread her hands in a gesture of confusion. "What more could you possibly want?" she asked. "You are a pre-spacefaring species with no military capability. You should be grateful that the Conclave is willing to spare you at all." Park leaned forward across the negotiating table, and Thiessen found herself leaning back despite her superior size. "We want a seat at the Conclave," Park said. "We want access to faster-than-light technology. We want full recognition as a sovereign species with all the rights and protections that entails. And we want a mutual defense pact that guarantees the galaxy will have a reason to keep us alive." Thiessen could not believe what she was hearing. "Those are the demands of a great power," she protested. "Not a species that cannot even leave its own solar system." Park smiled again, and this time the expression showed teeth. "Then I suggest you help us leave our solar system," she said, "because right now we have nothing to lose. And a species with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in the universe. But if you give us something to protect, something to care about, Then we will have a reason to play by your rules. The logic was brutal and simple and completely human. They were not asking for mercy. They were offering a deal. Give us a future, and we will become part of your civilization. Refuse, and we will become your worst nightmare. Disney returned to the conclave with humanity's demands. And the debate that followed lasted for 3 weeks and nearly triggered 2 separate diplomatic crises. The Vethkai were furious at being denied their harvest, and they threatened to withdraw from the conclave entirely. And for a few tense days, it seemed like the galaxy might fracture over the fate of one small world. But in the end, the mathematics were too clear to ignore. The cost of harvesting Earth was no longer measured in ships and soldiers. It was measured in centuries of looking over shoulders and wondering if this was the day that humanity came for revenge. The vote passed by a narrow margin, and Earth was granted provisional membership in the Conclave of Aligned Worlds. Ambassador Thiessen was chosen to deliver the news, and she returned to Colorado to meet with General Park one final time. You have what you wanted, Thiessen said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Your species has been recognized as equals, and the Vethkai have withdrawn their fleet, and you will receive the technology you need to join us among the stars. Park nodded, and for the first time, Thiessen saw something other than cold calculation in the human's eyes. She saw hope. Thank you, Ambassador, Park said. I know this was not easy for you, and I know many in the Conclave will never forgive us for what we did. Thiessen was quiet for a long moment before she responded. I have studied your history extensively over these past months, she said, and I still do not fully understand your species. You are capable of such terrible cruelty, and yet you are also capable of great kindness and creativity and love. Park laughed softly. We do not understand ourselves most of the time, she admitted, but we try to be better than we were, and sometimes we succeed. Thiessen returned to the conclave and submitted her final report on humanity. And when a junior aide asked her what classification the humans should receive, she thought carefully before responding. She wrote, Apex Persistence Predator. Do not engage, do not provoke, do not corner. She paused and added one final line. They were supposed to be prey. They refused. 20 years later, humanity's first faster-than-light vessel launched from Earth orbit, and the crew had painted something on the hull that made Thiessen smile when she saw the images. It read, We remember who helped. We remember who did not. The galaxy had marked Earth as a target. Now humanity was writing its own list.